Hello and welcome to Kickback Science Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Luke. This podcast is your place to get the tools and knowledge necessary to navigate the world of health and wellness. So kick back, let's talk science. This is good content. This stuff has gone crazy. We'll jump into it. Let's dive in. Let's do a little science. I'm going nitty gritty science right now.
I've been looking forward to this.
Kind of going on a little bit of a tangent.
Oh yeah, that's right. I forgot about that.
The information we discuss in this podcast is not meant to be taken as medical advice. It is simply informative. We're not affiliated with any organization or institution, just a few guys talking science and having fun. Joe, you'll figure it out between one of those three.
Miss you, Joe.
Yeah, we miss you, Joe. Another one without Joseph, our editor, the chief editor of the Kickback Science Podcast.
The humor.
So bear with us again as we don't have Joe. I missed you, Reed.
Bear with us.
Yeah.
I miss you too.
Yeah, bear with us. Thanks for tuning in to another Kickback Science episode. Today, we are going to build on what we talked about last week. So I hope I've convinced you why you need muscle and why muscle is the most important organ in the body. Bless you, Reed. And now we're here to talk about how the hell do you get muscle. We're going to go deep into like hypertrophy, muscle building type training, hit on things like how can you grow the biggest muscles possible and where's the research at with that. If you haven't listened to why muscle is important, I encourage you to listen to that. That was last week's episode. But for this one, how the hell do we get muscle, right?
Yeah, how do we get it? So kind of break down the process of building muscle before we start. Like, how does muscle build?
Yeah.
I know we talked about fibers last podcast. Let's kind of talk about how muscles are built.
Yeah, so we've talked a bunch on this podcast about how our body adapts to different stressors. And so when we lift weights, our muscles, so we talked about how myosin is kind of grabbing on the actin and pulling that muscle shorter. Well, over time, if the myosin has a hard time contracting, so if it's, heavy weight or a lot of reps, it's going to get harder and harder and harder. And eventually that muscle is going to approach fatigue where you can't contract anymore. And that process is like a signal to the brain of like, holy shit, that was tough. And I don't want to go through that again. So it'll communicate to these nuclei within the cell to build more components and to build back better and stronger to be able to handle that intensity in the future so that it isn't stressed. Your body's kind of just like wanting to be as comfortable as possible always. And so when you stress it, it's going to adapt to handle that stress
environment.
Exactly. Yep. And that's something I didn't touch on in the other podcast of like, I mentioned how you signal to the nucleus of that cell to produce more proteins. Now, the muscle has a bunch of nuclei. Now, this is not true for other cells in the body. And that should just show you how important the freaking muscle is in general. Like the nucleus is this, has this blueprint for the entire cell. Well, the muscle has so many of them and can just like the efficiency that it can build. And our body must want muscle around if it's going to, provide all these nuclei for just one cell. But the nucleus will signal to grow muscle. These are called satellite cells. These satellite cells are kind of hanging on the edge of the muscle cell, and they can sense muscle damage, the stress level of the muscle, and they'll just kind of spit out all these components to go through protein synthesis and build different components of the cell so that next time that cell is stressed, or experiences that stress, it's better equipped to handle it, if that makes sense. Does it? Answer me, damn it.
Yeah, just water break.
I know. Good. I'm glad it makes sense.
Yeah, we're good.
So basically we're just, the muscle's been stressed and it's going to change the components to build back.
Yeah.
Build back stronger.
Fueling that muscle to build it back is protein.
Which exactly.
Yeah.
So like if you don't have the components to build muscle, which is all just those amino acids that go into building these different proteins for the different organelles within your muscle cell that make up your muscle, If you don't have protein, can't do anything, right?
Yeah.
And what's interesting about this, when you think about that, if you don't have protein, and let's say a lot of people do this type of training where they're just like looking for aesthetics, trying to get as bulky as possible, just for the aesthetics, which is great. You know, like that's a awesome goal to have. Just try to like look good naked, right?
Yeah.
But the problem is people are like, well, you know, upper body is the most like noticeable with people. So I'm just going to train upper body and kind of neglect
Chicken
lower
legs,
body.
Yeah.
And if you're not getting protein, even if you are getting protein, but you're not getting enough protein, what happens is your body's really good at thinking, okay, I got to build and I don't have enough protein. Where am I going to get protein from? Your muscle is like a storage unit for amino acids and protein. It has so much. Your body doesn't want to break it down. It's going to try to protect it at all costs, but if it needs to, it's not going to steal it from other organs. So you'll see people like this process gets so warped where like you're getting bigger and bigger and bigger upper body, and you're actually getting smaller and smaller and smaller lower body.
It's taking that
because it's like literally like you'll see this change in muscle volume to accommodate. And so like that just brings up, it's important to like, if you're doing hypertrophy training, which is the size of the muscle, if you're trying to get big muscles, it's important to do all of your muscles. If you neglect muscles, your body's like, well, we don't need muscle here, so let's pull from here and go to this muscle. Like that's how precise these things are. And when I say muscle hypertrophy, so again, I'm talking about the size of the muscle. One thing that we still don't know, although there was a really interesting paper just published about this topic, but we don't know, is it because the muscle cells themselves are just becoming larger? You know, we're making more of this actin and myosin. Is it because the space within that muscle is becoming larger? Like we're retaining more fluid and more cellular components to make that cell larger. Between those two, I mean, the sense is it really doesn't matter in there. It seems to be we're making more of those contractile proteins, or really it seems to be there's a combination of both. As your muscle needs to build more components of the cell, it's going to retain more fluid. That fluid's going to increase the volume of the cell itself. Both of these processes are occurring. There was a recent paper just published June 19th in MSSE, and it showed that people who had long-term training actually had more muscle fibers themselves. So increase the amount of fibers. Now, that sounds like, oh, that makes sense, right? But this area of research, you know, we've thought that humans can't actually increase the amount of cells. You've probably heard like, you know, when you're gaining fat or losing fat, you're accumulating fat within each of those cells. You don't actually like lose fat cells or gain fat cells. Well, we've thought the same thing with muscle specifically, where you're just gaining the size of those muscle cells. You're not increasing the actual cells themselves. This was discovered in other animals like cats. There's an old study that we base a lot of this off of, where they had like cats do weight training.
Nice.
Like essentially like they'll have like a weighted, and so they'll have to go up to like access food and water. And so it's like they're doing squats, and they were able to increase the amount of fibers, but we don't see that in humans consistently. Well, we really don't see it at all. But this paper just came out and looked at long-term training adaptations and short-term or like sedentary people, and found that long-term training may actually lead to more muscle fibers. I bring that up for you ex-phys nerds out there that, you know, this often gets talked about in a lot of courses. We'll pull up that June 19th paper in MSSE and take a peek at that. Their theory is that these studies that look at resistance training adaptations and showed that it's just the size of the cell itself and it's not actually more cells, which we call hyperplasia. Their theory is that it's actually too short term. You got to look at more long-term adaptations, you know, multiple years of resistance training before you see that. But who knows? We'll see as that comes out. I just want to point that out because it's a recent study and it's really interesting. And I know that if you're an exercise phys nerd, you've heard this in your lectures and stuff before. So if it gets brought up, just raise your hand and be like,
hey,
did you see that paper in MSSE come out suggesting otherwise? Just give you a little trivia knowledge. But So that's what happens. That's what happens.
It happens in the muscle.
That's what happens.
That's how you get them.
Oh, and this mostly happens in type 2 muscle fibers.
Okay.
That's not to suggest type 1 muscle fibers can't grow in size, but type 2 muscle fibers have a greater capacity to do so. So most of the time when you see an increased size of muscle fibers, most of it's coming from type 2. But type 2-1 can also increase. Yep. Or type 2-1.
Type 2-1.
Yeah. Type 1. Type 1 can also increase.
So what's the frequency that you should do in the gym to get the optimal amount of muscle mass gain? I'm working out my biceps. We're focusing on the biceps here. We're going to get some Arnold biceps.
Straight up biceps.
Just do biceps.
Yeah. just only do biceps.
All day, every day.
So there's a few meta-analyses that group together all the data and frequency, and Brad Schofield's group does a really good job. He's got a bunch of meta-analyses and has kind of led the way in like frequency, intensity, time, type for hypertrophy specifically. And that group's research, along with some other meta-analyses, suggests that like the optimum amount of times training each muscle group is 2 times per week.
Okay.
Now, the difference between 1 and 2 times per week is not significant. It's approaching significance. And by that, I mean, like, there is more of an influence on muscle size from 1 to 2 times per week. But from 2 to 3 and beyond, there's not much change.
Okay.
And so 2 times per week per muscle group seems to be the goal there, but you do still see pretty significant hypertrophy gains in just 1 time per week.
Okay.
So yeah, 2 times per week for frequency.
Because I was kind of breaking that down, because a lot of people do like back and bicep day, and then they'll do legs, chest and triceps, and then like shoulders. Like that would be like 6 days plus if you had to do 2 times for each muscle group. That would be pretty crazy. That's a lot. That's a lot of time you got to commit there.
Yeah.
To get those gains.
Well, so like frequency is just one part of this equation, right? Mm-hmm. You're basically just trying to stress that muscle out.
Yeah.
And 1 time a week, you can get that pretty well if that 1 time, if you're working out 6 days per week and you're targeting 1 muscle, you'll see this in a lot of bodybuilding programs where people will like do just straight up chest day, straight up shoulder day, straight up, back day.
Yeah.
And you can spend way more time on that 1 muscle group specifically. So you get more sets, more reps,
more volume,
and more volume that 1 day.
Yep.
And then you can just do 1 day per week, and it ends up equaling out long term. But actually, like, it seems to be that this 2 times per week is more optimum to that 1 time per week programming.
So you want to do the same exercises. So like you do back and biceps on Monday, and then you go back to back and biceps on like Wednesday or Thursday. Would you do the same exercises or different variations of back exercises?
Yeah, that actually doesn't seem to matter either. There's let's see if I can find the paper. So there is a systematic review of like exercise order and, multi-joint versus single joint. And that doesn't seem to have an influence at all either.
Okay.
And what you do want to do though, is you need to make sure you're properly progressing. And so if you're going to just do the same workout every time you come in, your muscles are going to get adapted to that. And so you do want to do a specific movement or target a specific muscle group by doing a variety of movements. But that process, you can wait 4 to 6 weeks before you switch up the type of movement there. So get optimum benefit from, like let's say you're focusing on, like a machine-based movement and then switch into a free weight movement and however you want to do it. But changing it up over the course of, 6 to 8 weeks. I don't know how long you usually did like programming.
Yeah, it was around that time. Yeah, I would do like 6 to 8 weeks of endurance for people that just started out to get that endurance up. And then I'd go to hypertrophy. Usually with my clients, I'd just do back and forth. They weren't very interested in doing the whole strength aspect and like putting up heavy weights. That just wasn't their thing, even though that is important too. But those I usually just bounce back between the two, endurance and hypertrophy, the 8 to 12.
Yeah. And there's some research on the impact of doing like a 6 to 8 week conditioning program prior to strength training further optimizes hypertrophy. So if you're just going from like couch to trying to be a bodybuilder, like conditioning beforehand seems to improve overall hypertrophy down the line.
Yep.
So that sounds like a kind of a similar approach to what you were utilizing. So that's frequency, amount of times per week. Yeah. And the splits are going to be all over the place. Some people do back and biceps. Some people do, the just straight up 1 day per week bodybuilding regimen.
Yeah. Is there a perfect split there? Like back and bicep, chest and tricep, leg day. Like, should you be doing that, or should you do all anterior, so like biceps and chest day, and then do back and triceps day? Is there an optimal workout plan for that to get those muscle mass like growth?
So what we know thus far is, or I should say based on what we know. So we know 1 day per week is going to increase muscle growth. 2 days per week seems to be optimum. But in order to answer that question, let's talk about, how many reps, how many sets you should do. So there's a couple great reviews on both of these things. So a 2020 review showed that if you're going hypertrophy specific, it doesn't seem to matter if you're going high repetition versus low repetition. So they compared less than 8 reps to 9 and greater reps. Actually, this particular systematic review did 9 to 15 reps. Showed that there's no difference. The thing is, though, you need to approach or even get to failure on each of those sets if you can. And I say approach because there is another review that shows as long as like volume is equated, you don't really you can still get the same hypertrophy having what we call reps in reserve. So like you don't have to actually get to fatigue as long as volume is equated. I'm going to pull up that paper really quick. Oh, actually, so that was in my initial notes, but this paper just came out yesterday. Oh, like nice. When I was like this morning, just looking up, making sure I didn't miss any of the literature. It was like published 19 hours ago. So this is a systematic review on reps in reserve. And they found that there's a linear association between reps in reserve and load. And if you have a lower load, meaning like less percentage of your 1 repetition max, so an easier, lighter weight, you do have to approach fatigue, have less reps in reserve versus having a higher weight. You can have more reps in reserve. Yeah. But it did show like the closer you get to fatigue, the greater influence you have. What's interesting though, is this paper also found that the influence of higher rep ranges, you're able to actually target type 1 muscle fiber hypertrophy better than the low rep ranges, which is important for if your goal is hypertrophy to try to get as big of biceps as you possibly can. You want to shift between a low rep range and a high rep range, because when you're doing the high rep range, so lower weight, more reps, but still pushing yourself to fatigue, you're getting more of that type 1 muscle fiber hypertrophy. And then when you change your programming, 6 weeks later and you're doing 12, heavier and, you're doing more 8 reps, then you're going to get that type 2 muscle fiber influence. And both of those are still happening with each program. It's just you're able to target each specifically. So if you're trying to like really just optimize muscle size, the bodybuilding aesthetic approach, doing both seems to be the way to go. Yeah. But it does seem like, the way I look at it, because the research has been kind of all over the place in terms of like, do you actually have to hit failure? The way I look at it is, with the amount of research suggesting that going till failure improves hypertrophy, it's conflicting, but it's not going to hurt. I would say go till failure anytime you can. It's hard to know if you're at failure. What I would encourage everyone to do is try it once. And if you think you've been going till failure, just try it one time when you have someone there with you that can help you get that last movement. And you'll realize, I have
This is
not
what
been
it's like,
going
yeah.
till failure. Yeah, like usually, in my experience, I don't know if it's the same with you. Like working with people who are like, "Oh yeah, I went till failure." It's like, no,
You didn't.
you could have done 3,
Yeah.
maybe even 4 more reps.
It's
You
really
just-
hard to do that in like a bench press because you think you're going to get just
Yeah.
clotheslined. But hit it. That last rep should be your best one. Like it should be. You should feel it the most.
Yep.
If not, you got to go up and wait.
Yeah. And what was your original question? Oh, it was about splits.
Yeah.
And now I'm on this
Like
crazy
biceps.
tangent, so-
Like, what's the optimal?
Yeah.
Like biceps back, triceps, chest.
So
Is there-
knowing that you can get there with a certain amount of reps, you also, it looks like somewhere between 12 and 20 sets per muscle group per week
Oh, okay.
is required too. Yeah.
was
So
like, whoa.
yeah, no, not
German
per,
volume
yeah.
training. Like, that's so intense.
So that's per week. And then the amount of sets per exercise or per lift you do, 2 to 3 seems optimum. There is an improvement in hypertrophy from lifts 4 to 6, so or sets. If you have 4 to 6 sets, you're going to get the greatest influence in muscle size. But it's not a crazy jump from 2 to 3. So I'd say, again, if hypertrophy is like your number one goal, shoot for 4. But if, you're strapped on time, 2 to 3 seems to cut it. And then making sure, so 2 to 3 sets per exercise, 12 to 20 total sets
Yeah.
throughout the course of the week. And again, it's the same. When you look at these review papers, you'll see anything above 20 seems to be a waste of time.
Yeah.
And so you're better off, focusing on other aspects of your training than trying to get 30 sets of one muscle group. And then we talked how 2 times per week is optimum. So knowing those things, we can talk about how you split it up. You got to get, let's put a nice even number, 15 total sets per muscle group per week. And if you can come in and do a back or just straight up back day, and you can do like 15 sets of all back workouts and hitting those rep ranges that we talked about, trying to approach fatigue, and you can do that in 1 week, you'll get the stimulus you need for hypertrophy. But the problem is you got to be consistent then, because the next you do chest, the next you would do arms, and so on. Like if you miss a day, you're kind of setting yourself up for failure. So the 1 day splits of like focusing on one muscle group at a time, that's for people that can consistently make it in 6 days per week and aren't going to take a day off.
Yeah.
It's a great approach because you can, go ham on that one muscle group during that day, but it's hard for everybody. I would recommend something that you're talking about where it's like you kind of have a lower body, a push day, and a pull day. And you that way you can try to get in 6 days a week if you can, but if you miss a day, you've still hit that muscle group during that week. And an even better way to do it is if you can do like a upper and lower body split, because then you can dedicate 4 days in a week, do upper body, lower body, upper body, lower body. And
you still see the same result, like improved results.
Yeah.
Okay.
You're not going to have any difference. And that's the interesting part about
I
the
usually
research.
do total body because I can't get in more than 4 days a week.
Yeah.
So like I've just been doing that, and I've seen plenty of gains with that.
Yeah. And that's a great approach too. Cause like if you do a full body workout, I mean, theoretically you could go twice in that week. And as long as you're hitting, I mean, those are long days to hit that, 15 sets per muscle group per week. But if you can do that, you're not going to get, your hypertrophy gains are going to be the same.
Yeah.
But I mean, like, I think what happens with a lot of these like bodybuilding forums and people suggesting that you need this like 1 day per muscle group approach, like the research is pretty evident that when you compare those approaches, there isn't a difference. So it's really what's more, what can you fit into your week? So how do you want to split it up that way?
So just structuring your plan, like your schedule, to hitting at least 15 to 20 sets per muscle group is optimal.
Yep.
So just when you're sitting down building your plan, just make sure you get those noted, and then you'll get optimal results.
And so you're making sure that each workout you're doing is at least 2 sets but shoot for 4.
Yeah, I always do like 3 to 4. Like if I still got more juice, I'm going to go 4, and that's going to be my like, that's all I got.
Yep. Yeah, 4 seems to be like that golden number where you're in that next set of like you're going to get more hypertrophy for sure than 3. And then however you want to structure your rep range, as long as you hit fatigue. If you're somebody who doesn't like lifting really heavy weights, who cares? If you can estimate your 1 rep max, so what's the weight that you can only move 1 time for that lift, and then you take a percentage of that, like you can do just half that weight pretty much, and just do it until you fatigue, and it's going to have the same influence of like,
you can easily find those on your phone, just like 1 rep max, and they'll just give you a calculation. So
yeah. And we'll have pretty soon here, on our programming, we'll have a way that you can go through and estimate your 1 rep max for these lifts too. But so it's however you want to do it in terms of that. And that's like, this is kind of idiot proof, like hypertrophy training. If you put in the work, like you do it however you want. It's not as specific to like power and strength, which we'll talk about in a whole nother podcast. Like hypertrophy is, like there's so many ways to get to that end goal of hypertrophy.
And like, how about rest times for hypertrophy? Are we looking at 30 to a minute?
This is an interesting area of research because the meta-analyses that I'm aware of compare rest times with strength and hypertrophy, and everything is related to strength. Like longer rest times are required for strength exercises, whereas it doesn't seem to matter with hypertrophy. And that makes sense, right? We're trying to go to fatigue, and it doesn't seem to matter if you do low weight, high reps versus high weight, low reps. And so however you get there, I mean, like rest doesn't seem to make or play a big role. The way I think of it is try to give yourself a minute in between, or at least 30 seconds, so you can replenish enough fuel inside your muscle cells so you can do that movement again. Because remember, you got to do 4 sets of this lift. You're not going to do 4 sets if you're taking 10-second breaks. So however you can get through that 4 sets.
Listen to your body, kind of like.
The rest time, though, doesn't seem to play a role in terms of like, if you rest longer, you'll get more hypertrophy.
Yeah.
That's not the case, but it is the case with something like strength.
Okay. What about like tempo? Like I would always focus on the eccentric. So people that wanted to build muscle, I would always focus on the eccentric movement. So like on a bicep curl, it's the downward motion, just controlling that. So is there any truth to that? Like eccentric will build muscle faster?
Yeah. There's a couple meta-analyses. So one by Brad Schofield's group in 2017, and then another one by Nunez and colleagues in 2020. Both of those show like there might be, it's very inconsistent. Like eccentric may not play a role at all in terms of improving hypertrophy, but it is very clear that it is not having a negative impact. And there are studies that show that eccentric training does improve hypertrophy, like individual studies. But when you look at these studies across the group, like those meta-analyses I'm talking about, they find that there's not a significant difference. But there is a trend there that we are aware of that kind of points to, similar to like the fatigue idea, like maybe just do it because it's not gonna impair strength or hypertrophy, and it might improve it, but it really doesn't seem to be significant like we initially thought. And the reason that people think eccentric is so beneficial is because as you have this heavy weight that you're slowly lowering, we're thinking, okay, those myosin actin bonds, we're kind of forcing those to open up, and we might be causing more damage within the muscle, like a good kind of damage, or more stress to the muscle. And then we're going to have a greater adaptation. Makes sense theoretically, but it doesn't seem to be that that's having an influence on muscle hypertrophy. As far as tempo goes, though, time under tension is just adding to the overall like volume of that exercise. So if you're going super quick and you're just like doing a rep and then relaxing, your muscles are not active for nearly as long as that tempo lift. And so if you're adding tempo, you're just further increasing the volume of load that is placed on that muscle. So that's always going to like, and I tell people like exaggerate that. like count to 3 in both directions if you can. It seems crazy, but when you do it, it has a difference.
Yeah, like one, 2, 3, and then 1, 2, and back
yeah,
up.
like literally like 1, 2, 3 in both directions. And like, that's just going to help you get increased time under tension and increased muscle activation.
What about total body workouts? Are they just as effective in building hypertrophy as just isolating, or should we just stick to isolating for this hypertrophy to build bigger biceps or bigger shoulders?
Yeah, actually, there is another systematic review meta-analysis showing multi-joint versus single joint exercises. There's no difference in terms of hypertrophy. Okay. So that's really going to be how you want to do it.
Yeah.
Just making sure that you're targeting those muscles that you want to grow if you're doing multi-joint exercises versus
like a compound movement, that would be good for people that have limited time, but they can do a lower body, upper body workout, get the same effects, same sets, volume. So that's a good thing. If you have more time, isolation's good, but compound if you have less time.
Yeah.
What about supersets?
Supersets. So let me pull up paper on supersets. So this just came out too. 2024 paper, again, out of Brad Schofield's lab. And they found that they're like, no matter how you supersetted the lifts. So in this group of research, I mean, there's a variety of ways to do supersets. No matter how you superset a lift, it doesn't impact hypertrophy. And I mean, like, if you've seen
in a negative way or a positive way,
or in not a negative way. Some people are like, "Oh, don't do superset; you're going to fatigue, and like it's going to impair muscle growth." Like, focus on the one lift.
Yeah,
but that's not true. Supersetting is great, and in these papers, they got done with the workout on average of 36% quicker. So like you're finishing the workout faster, and it's not impairing hypertrophy. So I'd say superset by all means. Arnold, he's got a documentary, and there's footage of him back in his prime bodybuilding days, and he supersets like everything.
I do it.
I mean, you look at him when he's doing like bench press, and then he'll go straight to like lat pull down, and then go back and forth and just beat the hell out of these like muscle groups that are responsible. Like, oh, he's doing a push movement and a pull movement, and then while he's doing the pull movement, his push movement muscles are taking a little rest, and so he can just beat the hell out of them. And then his rest is just while he's doing that other lift. Yep. And that's a great way to do it if you're strapped on time, or if you just want to try to get it as much as you can out of that workout.
Yeah.
So yeah, supersets don't impair muscle growth.
I typically superset like 4 exercises. It'll be like a back, bicep. So it's kind of like a triangle of exercises.
I like to do that too. I don't, a lot of times I'll just alternate muscle groups when I'm in the gym. So like some lifts, like the bigger lifts, especially if I'm worried about the machine getting taken, if it's busy, I'll just stay there for the whole 4 sets, and then I'll switch to a different muscle group. So like if I'm doing a back and biceps, I'll do back for all 4 sets, and then I'll go do biceps for all 4 sets. Yeah. But some of them I'll cycle in. The tough part about back and biceps is like when you do back, you're working biceps. And so after doing like a bunch of back, you go do biceps, and it's like, oh my God, like I was just doing this.
That happens to me all the time. I'm like, it's hard to grip the bar when you're like doing a pull. It's like, oh man. How about blood flow restriction? I worked in a therapy clinic, and we did a lot of blood flow restriction for people with like knee injuries. Are those beneficial? I also see people do that with like biceps when they're doing bicep curls. They'll like pinch off the blood flow here and just get more blood flow right to that bicep. Are there any advantages to doing that, or any risks?
Yeah. Well, so the thing about blood flow restriction, I was kind of like hesitant with this early on. And just because of like, I don't know. I think it was like, this was before I was super familiar with the research, and I looked at it as like, oh, you're just trying to like get out of this easy and not do heavy weight. You got to do heavy weight. But now realizing like, oh, you don't. It seems to be like to get the most hypertrophy, or the greatest influence of hypertrophy, you just have to figure out a way to send a message to that muscle to make it think it's in a stressful environment. And all those nuclei that I talked about within the muscle, they'll take a bunch of different signals and it'll resemble stress. So one of those signals is like, a reduced amount of blood flow and reduced oxygen delivery to the muscle. And it turns out that when you do blood flow restriction, and for people like, well, you just did a good job describing it. Essentially, there's these different, like, they look like blood pressure cuffs, essentially, that you can utilize that will strap around above the muscle that you're working. And then you'll work that muscle at a lighter weight, and you'll just go until fatigue, but you'll fatigue a little quicker because you're cutting off the circulation to that muscle, and you're creating this stressful environment for it. Well, there was a paper just from a few weeks ago out of a lab in Brazil, and this was a systematic Brazil. This was a systematic review of meta-analyses looking at different studies using blood flow restriction, and the rep ranges were anywhere from 15 all the way up to like 75 reps. Kind of crazy. The 75 rep study, that was kind of an outlier that they actually didn't include in their analysis. They had it as a separate analysis, but essentially, like, what they showed is high load resistance training being above 50% of 1 rep max. Actually, it was above 70% of 1 rep max without blood flow restriction. So they had these participants do, just your regular resistance training. And then they did less than 50% 1 rep max with blood flow restriction up to about 15 reps. And they showed that the blood flow restriction was able to have the same level of hypertrophy as the higher load. And I was like, I've been pretty shocked by the consistency of the research in here. Because again, I was a little bit hesitant at first. It's like, you're not like necessarily creating that damage to the muscle. But again, it seems to be that you just have to try to figure out how to stimulate the muscle cell into thinking that it needs to build, and it will build. And that's a good way to do it. So yeah, blood flow restriction is kind of cool. There's definitely, like, you asked about the risks here, like you're cutting off circulation. Like a tourniquet almost, and like when you let go of it, like rushing back to your heart, like that kind of worries me a little bit personally. But yeah, so if you're healthy, your blood vessels can if you're healthy, your blood vessels can tolerate that, no problem. That process of what we call shear stress. So if you occlude a blood vessel and then you open it up, that rush of blood flow is sensed by the blood vessel immediately, and then it just opens up nicely. And like that's if you're healthy. But people that have cardiovascular disease, atherosclerosis, I can't say that word, but you always know what I'm talking about. I know what you're saying. Yeah, I can't say it. Atherosclerosis. If they have that, I mean, then your blood vessels don't adapt to that shear stress as well. And
so someone with that, just stay away from something like that, blood flow restriction.
Probably. But also, like, just don't have that. Don't restrict blood flow for too long, too. I mean, like, one of the things that happens in a variety of diseases that causes organ failure is ischemia. If you don't deliver oxygen to organs, including your muscle, like, that could cause some damage to those organs. And so, like, restricting blood flow, like, I still have this, like, a little bit of concern about the idea of it, but it sure does seem in the research to be beneficial.
Oh, nice.
Or to have the same influence.
Yeah. And then how about like muscle lengthening? Is there a part where you should stop, or should you just always keep that tension in your muscles, or should you do full range of motion?
So
in your every lift, should you do full range of motion, or should you just keep it just very tight and just does that build muscle faster, or should you be doing that full range?
So this is...
or we can use that as squats too, like people going all the way down.
Full range of motion.
Yeah.
It's kind of crazy how this like field of research that we're talking about right now has just like all these papers have come out in the last few weeks. So at that question, there's a meta-analysis again out of Brad Schofield's lab 4 weeks ago that looked at this, like muscle length. How does that have an influence on muscle growth? And the results are pretty conflicting. It does seem to be that increased muscle length does improve not just hypertrophy, but also has an influence on overall length of those individual muscle fibers themselves. Yeah. Which would then say like, oh, you're increasing length of those cells. You could be having an influence on like mobility. And also there's a trend towards an improved hypertrophy with greater range of motion. And so I would say for sure, try to get as much range of motion as you can.
Because I know when I do full range of motion, I can't lift as much, so I don't feel like I'm doing as much, but I do feel that more of a stretch. So that's essentially what you're looking for.
And it is, it seems to be having an influence. Again, conflicting. Yeah. There's not a ton of consistent research. The problem with doing these systematic reviews and meta-analyses is in order to have like a proper analysis of the data, you need the studies to be designed pretty similarly, which usually, in a field like this, you'll see a lot of consistent studies come out. But these very hyper-specific questions that you're asking, we do have answers for a lot of them, but without a ton of data, it's hard to kind of jump to a conclusion there.
And then let's talk about protein. I know we have a whole podcast on that. And if you'd like to dive in, just look at our protein podcast. But how much protein should I be getting? So I'm sitting at like 175 right now. I'm trying to grow as much muscle mass as possible. Do I want to just sit at 175 grams of protein, or do I want to be hitting 200? What should I be looking at if I'm trying to grow as much muscle mass as possible?
Yeah, so hypertrophy specifically, like this is huge. The best way to grow muscle is resistance training. And if, like we've been talking about, but if you don't have the components that your muscle cell needs to build, it's not going to build. You're not going to grow muscle. The research in this area is pretty clear that the greatest benefit you get from hypertrophy is when you have greater than 1.7 grams per kilogram of protein, all the way up to 2.7 grams per kilogram of protein, 2.2 kilograms per pound. And so essentially, you're looking at right around a gram per pound of protein that you need to optimize muscle growth. You can even go higher than that. Some of these studies go above 3. Like there's a paper with 3.5 grams per kilogram, which is like you're approaching 2 grams per pound of protein. Like that's hard to even hit.
That's so hard.
And go listen to the protein podcast if you want to learn, there's a difference between animal and plant-based protein, and you want to try to get leucine as much as possible. We break that down pretty well in the protein podcast. But as far as total amount, if you're getting a gram per pound, you don't have to focus much on the composition of the protein. Animal is always going to be better than plant protein for hypertrophy. A gram per pound is great. It doesn't seem to matter at all when you're getting that protein in, as long as you're getting in. So the research in this area is pretty clear. You look at people that have protein immediately after. There's even like pre, during, and immediately post studies comparing with 3 hours later, and then measuring how your muscles protein synthesis process is going, well beyond or well later than your workout. And it's pretty clear that there's not this anaerobic window that you need to get this protein shake in immediately after exercise. Okay. As long as you're getting that protein in, and it's not just at like one sitting. The best way to do this, and Don Lehman's lab, which we talked about in the protein podcast, they've put out a lot of research on this area of try to shoot for, like around 40 grams of protein per meal. And you space that out, and you can get more than that or you can add a shake or something. But try to space that out, and then you're never going to be in this catabolic state, other than when you're exercising. And then I should mention though, like this anabolic window doesn't really seem to exist like people suggest, but it is a good rule of thumb to just, like for me, I just like to have a protein shake afterwards. And if you're training for hypertrophy specifically, muscle glycogen, when your muscle stores glucose, it will retain water in that process, and that will aid in the size of the muscle. So you don't just want protein, you want to get carbohydrates in that supplement as well. So for people that are in bodybuilding or want to increase muscle growth, a good rule of thumb is about a 1-to-1 ratio carbohydrates to protein in your shake. So like if you have a 50 gram protein shake, try to get 50 grams of carbohydrate in there. And that number goes up the more intense that workout is. So the longer duration, more intense, then, increase carbs a little bit. And you can approach like 2 to 3 to 1 ratio. So like 3 times as many carbs as protein, just to make sure you're getting all that glycogen replenished and that protein is there to be able to build.
Yeah. like you'd see some people like have Skittles or like gummy bears just to get that energy up and that carbohydrates going. How about lifting where you have a high weight and then go down in weight, or do you want to lift at a lower weight and increase your weight each time? Is there a difference between those, or any, like, is one better than the other? So say I start at 100 pounds doing flies. Next set I do 110. Next set I do 120. Or should I do max weight and then go down, or just stay at max weight?
So if we're talking hypertrophy specifically, no, it really doesn't seem to matter.
Okay.
I mean, I like I kind of got into this rhythm of like going up in weight and then doing a drop set.
Yeah,
at the
I do
end.
that too. 4-set drop set is just like, oh.
I just like the feeling of fatigue.
It's the best.
Like, and like Arnold said, wow, where's Joe right now? What he said, I'm the pump. I feel like I'm coming in the gym. I'm coming in the home. I'm coming in the gym. the pump. Everyone needs to get the pump. Yeah, Arnold knew it. So like the pump that you get from, like, for me, it's the lower repetition, that drop set that you really just go all out in.
Yeah.
We're like, but that there's not a ton of data suggesting that that's going to benefit me more. It's just like, that happens to be what I do. So however you want to do it, if you want to stay at the exact same weight, sure, just to get to fatigue.
As long as you get that volume and those sets in for each muscle.
If you don't like lifting heavy, don't lift heavy. Again, this is a nice part about hypertrophy. It's like, however the hell you want to do it, just make sure you're hitting those numbers we talked about and get to fatigue and get that protein in, and you're going to be beefy.
Let's talk about enhancers. So like creatine, we talked about that in the last podcast. Should people that want to get more muscle mass start implementing creatine in their daily routine?
Yeah, I would say, like, anytime that you can add like an aid in muscle function, it's going to improve these outcomes. And so creatine will help you push yourself in that workout. It's going to give you more fuel. You could retain more fluid within the muscle cell itself, although the research in that area is not as like clear as it seems to be, of like retaining all this water weight.
Yeah, a lot of people say their face gets like puffy, or they just feel like just puffier when they're on creatine. But you're saying that's not entirely true.
I mean, I don't buy it.
Okay.
Based on what I know, at least.
Okay. So supplementing creatine if you can, if you have the means, just taking it every day. That will help increase those gains as well.
I should also mention too, like you talking about supplementing just made me think, like, people that are really into building muscles specifically, you do have to get into a caloric surplus. You can't be in a calorie deficit.
Oh, so you can't be like cutting and bulk.
No, it doesn't. Like, it doesn't work that way efficiently. You can. There is research to suggest. So there's a paper that is on our social media page that I linked to a while ago that has a really cool model showing whatever calorie deficit you're in, how much muscle mass you can either gain or decrease. And right around that 500 calorie per day deficit is a number. You don't want to go further than 500 calories per day. Kato just walked. You don't want to go further than 500 calories per day, because then you start to lose muscle mass. You can gain in that slight calorie deficit, but you're just kind of doing yourself a disservice. If you want to gain muscle, if that's your biggest goal, you need to be in about a 10%.
So 2,200 calories, you're saying, but roughly, if you're around that 2,000.
Let's say you're at a 2,000 calories seems to be your sweet spot where you don't lose and you don't gain weight. Then you're going to want to shoot to 2,200, even to 2,300.
Okay.
And that's to allow those muscles to build as efficiently as possible. You want to make sure that you have the components necessary to build that muscle. And then, for like bodybuilders, they'll go through this caloric surplus period, and then they'll go through the caloric restriction to lose weight, but they won't restrict to the point where they're losing muscle. It's kind of that maintain muscle, but losing fat. And that's the process you'll see, is like, you need to be in a caloric surplus to get this. And
then you cut to get more defined.
Yep.
Okay. Awesome. So let's just go over, like, I was looking through my Reddit finds, but we basically hit them all, so there's no really reason to even go through them. But let's just go over the ideal plan. Let's summarize everything we just said for the listeners, how they can optimize getting the biggest muscles possible through hypertrophy.
Get beefy.
Yeah, let's just summarize everything we just said. Let's go through your game plan on how to achieve that.
Okay, so one of the things that we talk about in exercise science that I know a lot of people like read, this is going to give you some flashbacks to like the FIT VP principle, frequency, intensity, time, type, volume, and progression. Well, the big things within that and how that relates to hypertrophy specifically. So for people who don't know what that is, it's just kind of this algorithm we follow of like, what's the frequency to get this goal? What's the intensity to get this goal? And so on. Well, we touched on, so like if you want hypertrophy specifically, make sure you're hitting each muscle group 2 times per week. Now, the major muscle groups that you want to work on are chest, back, shoulders, biceps, triceps, glutes, hamstrings, quads, and calves. So am I missing anything, Reed?
No.
So those muscles, I said back.
Yep.
Okay, I feel like I was going through them slow. I'm like, all right, what muscles am I missing?
Legs, calves.
So those muscles, you want to make sure you're targeting 2 times per week. And each workout you do to target those muscles should be shoot for 4 sets of that lift, and then set it to whatever weight you're most comfortable with to where you can achieve fatigue. I wouldn't set it at a light weight and do like 50 reps. Like that's just a waste of time. Sure, you can do it. And that blood flow restriction paper kind of showed us that like these high reps, you're still getting these benefits. But, a good thing to do is just, are you more comfortable doing heavier weight or lighter weight? And then, just do 4 sets of, let's say 12 reps. And that 12th rep should be fatigue.
Yep.
Take a break, do another 12, take a break, do another 12, do that 4 times. And then throughout the week, you should have accumulated 15 total sets per muscle group. And so one day, let's say we're doing a chest workout. One day, if I did 2 chest workouts and I did 4 sets each, I'm at 8. I know I have to do another 7 at some point this week to target my chest in order to get the greatest hypertrophy benefit. So I'm going to have another chest day later in the week. Or I'm like, oh shit, I don't have time. I'm going to go through straight up 15 sets right at my chest because I'm not going to be able to get chest in later. So however you're going to get those sets and that frequency and intensity. Any other? Oh, cardio. So there is research, and I linked to this on our social media page. I have a post about like the impacts of cardio specifically on hypertrophy. And there's a lot of research on concurrent training where you're doing cardio in combination with resistance training. And it seems to be that high intensity interval training and running specifically impair muscle growth. So this doesn't mean you can't grow muscle if you're doing cardio. It just means that if muscle growth is your greatest goal, you probably don't want to be doing that.
Because you're building those type 1 fibers and the type 2 at the same time when you just want to be building the type 2, which are the ones that bulk up more, right?
Yeah, I mean, or like that's probably what it is you're targeting something completely different.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I mean, maybe there's more to it. Maybe there's something else with cardio specifically that's impacting your muscle's ability to go through protein synthesis. I'm not sure that we have like the answers, but what we do know is that it's not going to benefit muscle growth. And so again, if muscle growth, if muscle growth is your one goal, then you might want to ditch cardio. Or if you're going to do it, I mean, do like stairs or biking. Those didn't have an impact in the research.
And then diet for getting that optimal. What do you got to do?
Yeah. Protein, dude. Get that freaking protein. And carbohydrates.
You want to be in that surplus as well.
Yeah.
10%.
Yeah. Or just like, I think I've heard this too. I don't know if there's any research on this, but like if you go carnivore, you don't even have to work out. You just like grow muscle really quick.
I heard that too.
I'm sorry, carnivore people. That's not true. It's not true.
Just get jacked. You don't even have to go to the gym.
Yeah. And that's like, people are like so against steroids in this field too, or in this area. But like, if you look at the bodybuilding community and people that, have used anabolic steroids, I mean, and especially with athletes, people are like, oh, they're cheating, and like Lance Armstrong and all these athletes and stuff that use steroids. It's like, shut up. I mean, think about this. Like, they don't just automatically get muscle. Like this carnivore joke I just made. Like, you don't just take steroids and grow muscle. They're taking steroids because they put in so much work and need the steroids to help aid in that recovery process. Because one thing we didn't talk about, Reed, is like rest in between.
Oh, yeah.
So, and I mean like from one workout to the next. A good rule of thumb is to give your muscles about 48 hours in between when you beat the hell out of them so that they can build back. If you just keep hitting muscle,
do chest day one and then do chest day the
again
next
and
day.
again and again, remember, when you're working out, you're in that catabolic state, breaking down protein, and that period that lasts quite a long time. And if you don't give that protein or that muscle time to build back, it's not going to. And so you need time in between. Now, what anabolic steroids do is they speed up that process. And so people that take anabolic steroids are able to hit those muscle groups more frequently, like every day hit those muscle groups, but they still have to put that work in. So the people that are taking anabolic steroids and getting these benefits, they're working their asses off, and that's why they're taking them. And this isn't me saying that you should go out and take anabolic steroids, but in the field here, there is a safe way to do it, and people do it safely. And like Lance Armstrong, his steroids for like
blood doping.
Yeah, he used something called erythropoietin, where EPO, it's a signal to create more blood cells produced by your kidney. It basically just tells the body like, hey, let's get some more red blood cells, which deliver oxygen, which allowed him to maintain endurance. It's a little bit separate, but it's just to kind of like, I don't know, people bash on the steroid community. It's got such a bad rap to it, but like these things are naturally produced by your body. Like you could call testosterone replacement steroid. Like people are taking steroids and like, it's just kind of like got a bad name to it, and I don't think it should.
What about two-a-days? So say you do like a lower body and then upper body. Is there any increased benefits or no benefits at all? Just because there's a lot of people will train in the morning and then they'll take a break. Like Arnold used to do this, train in the morning and then train in the afternoon. Is there any research that shows that that's not beneficial? Or
so it's not that it's not beneficial, but it's not going to be more beneficial if you do 2-a-days versus once a day. If you don't have a lot of time and you do like a few sets in the morning and then you go later and you finish your workout later in the day type thing, like all these metrics we've been talking about hold true in terms of like the reps, the sets, and the intensity, no matter how you split it. It doesn't seem to make a difference. Now, if you're doing 2-a-days, you run the risk of overtraining, which is that like hyper catabolic state of not being able to build. And that can actually set you back a long way. There's athletes that have to take months off just to reset from overtraining. I would discourage the 2-a-days just from the sense of like, it's not necessary. It's not going to make them, it's not going to have a greater influence. It will for people that are taking steroids that can recover and can do that work without overtraining. But again, I'm not recommending steroids. There is a lot of health risk associated with steroids if you're not doing it safely. So
what about, taking us back to ex-phys days back in Mankato.
Go Mavs.
Roll Mavs. What about myostatin? So they talked about people that had more myostatin didn't grow muscle as faster compared to people that did. Did I say that correctly? Or is it if you have more myostatin in your body?
No. You said it right.
Yeah. So like, how do you determine that? Like, that's a factor too. Cause like I worked out religiously for years and years and years and I just didn't get as beefy as you. You look at a weight and you just blow up. So do you have anything to expand on that, or how do you get over that? Or is it just something you just have to grind through it?
Well, like myostatin isn't this, it doesn't work that way. There is like these crazy, interesting models of research where like it was first discovered in mice where they knocked out myostatin, and so these mice just turned into like freaking machines. And so that's where the mechanism was discovered. And myostatin will actually inhibit this synthesis pathway, and it's essentially a mechanism within your cell to stimulate, like to inhibit muscle protein synthesis. Now, these processes occur for a reason, and myostatin can be produced by the body if it's needed. It's not like you have a certain amount of myostatin and I have a certain amount of myostatin and it's going to stay the same all throughout our lives. Like this, as you resistance train, you're down regulating myostatin production. So you can have an influence on myostatin. Myostatin's not having, if that makes sense, like the production and the amount of myostatin isn't just like a, you have more than me type thing. It's influenced by other aspects.
That guy has a lot of myostatin. That guy doesn't have any.
Yeah. So no, it's not going to play a role. I mean, where genetics come into play is, you'll see people have different fiber type distributions, genetically, like, someone might have more of a type 2A fiber distribution or type 2X. I just made the mistake. Whoa. Type 2B muscle fiber distribution. Yeah.
Cheetahs.
This lion sack of shit.
Whoa.
Some people might have more of a type 2B fiber distribution, which could increase in size more. And so, like, that's where the genetic component comes in, is like, you may be born with more type 1 than someone who's born with more type 2. Now, these things you can mediate. Like I mentioned, type 2A fibers, you can kind of shift those fibers to behave more like type 1 or type 2. And so, like, everyone has the ability to grow muscle. But yeah, there is a genetic component to it as well.
Okay. That's kind of what I was getting at. Like, it takes me a long time to grow muscle, feels like, compared to some people, but it's not a whole factor, and I can change that.
Change it.
Anything else that you think we need to touch on before we scoot out of here? Say pieces to everybody. What did your overall plan? Protein.
So when you were working with clients, because I mean, you have a lot more experience in like training people for hypertrophy. Like, what was your approach? Knowing all this information, which I know you were like aware of while you were training, like, what are some things that you found, somebody who's starting, that's going for muscle growth? Like, you mentioned that you would do more of like a conditioning plan at the beginning. Now, what were some things that people responded well to? Some lifts that you're like, don't waste your time. You can get hurt with this. And like, what are your recommendations based on your experience working with people on hypertrophy? Not just from a research perspective.
Well, I usually did I was like the weight loss / corrective exercise guy. So I'd only do endurance and hypertrophy training. So I'd always get people that were working desk jobs. I'd put them through movement screening. 9 times out of 10, they have tight hamstrings, so their heels would come up anytime they squatted. So I would always put them through that endurance phase, get them back, make sure their heels get down. I'd usually put one of those boxes and work on just deadlifts, just basic functional movements. Then I ran into a lot of the clients, female clients, that didn't want to get bulky, like we've been saying. Like, I just don't want to get bulky. I just want to tone my arms, abs, and butt.
Yeah, like, ma'am, it's not just going to happen.
But then I got the athletes, like the high school athletes that we'd train hypertrophy. We would hit those 15 sets for every muscle group, increase our protein, and that was a lot of fun. But yeah, we would just hit the hypertrophy. I'd have them go 5 times a week, and I would do tracking them. But mostly my clients, though, were like the weight loss and just getting them into basic functional movements. So we had the 5 movements. It was push, pull, hinge, twist, and lunge. So that's what we had to focus on. So we didn't do too much of like hypertrophy right away, because I was really into not getting them injured, because then they would never come back. So that was kind of my approach there. So I didn't dabble insanely in the hypertrophy, but with like my older clients that I had for a while, we would go back and forth between that, because they weren't very interested in the strength stuff. So it was really just what they wanted. Yeah. And most of the time it was just weight loss for 9 out of 10 clients. So I don't know if I really answered it because it was really tough because I was mostly just the weight loss guy and the functional movement guy.
Did you find that like people who, like you said, the people that would come in and be like, I don't want to get big and bulky, like
All the time.
if someone were to start and have a goal of, losing fat, losing weight,
Yeah.
did you just like kind of like sneak in some resistance training and like, did you see anyone just totally shift to like, oh, I like this?
Oh yeah. People loved it. Like once you find out what exercise they like the most and you get their feedback, like, oh, I don't like doing these sled pushes. It's like, well, we got to do hit train, but like we'll find different ways to get that heart rate up and like just finding what each person enjoys about working out and just building off that, doing that exercise first, getting them in the rhythm. Like, oh, I like to do this. Like, oh, I feel that one. Like focusing on that and also focusing on like what they want to work out. If they don't feel it the next day after working out with me, I failed. So like really listening to what they were saying, that was key. So it was like hypertrophy on arms or glutes, abs. Like if they weren't feeling those, I wouldn't have any clients. So that was kind of, it's not really doing right towards them because I wasn't giving them the most optimal training, but I was giving them what they wanted basically. So it was an idea.
Well, I wish like that's what you got to do. I mean, like
you got to keep them coming back. They got to enjoy it.
That's the thing.
If they don't like doing back squats, we're not going to do back squats. We're going to do other variations of it, but we're not going to do that exact exercise.
Yeah. And people like are so intimidated by the gym, thinking that you got to like walk in with a gallon of water and scream and throw weights at the wall and like wear a cutoff t-shirt. Like that's not the case. Like you can meet with a trainer if you're unfamiliar with how to go about this, and like everyone's just going to help. All trainers should help you find a program that works well for you so you can do this. And if hypertrophy is something that you want to get into, you want to build muscle for like aesthetic purposes other than health purposes, or both, or, one or the other.
Yeah.
Where was I going? I don't know. Just do it.
Aesthetic purposes, just getting in the gym basically is finding what you love in the gym, getting in that so you're not thinking you have to get a gallon jug and throw weights at the walls and stuff. So just
there's not if you're not doing it, you're missing out. Yeah. You're missing out so much. And so I'll see you guys in the gym.
See you guys in the gym.
Anything else?
No, I think we covered it all.
Miss you guys.
I guess.
I'll miss you, Joe. Miss you, Reed.
Bye, Joe.
Thanks again for tuning in to the Kickback Science Podcast. We love talking science with all of you, and if you feel the same, you can support us by subscribing, hitting that like button, and giving us a follow on our social media pages. Don't forget, you can submit questions through our website and in the comments section of all our social media. Have a good one, everyone.